what I will present is a project that is an in-house project developed entirely at the Institute with the fantastic support of the Public Policy Program. And this has been a collaboration with Gonzalo Castañeda, who is an economist in the leading think tank in Mexico. And we'll be needing this probably. So before going into the details, I just want to acknowledge some of the partners that have made this project grow in what it is today. It started as just an academic discussion between two economists who wanted to understand how governments prioritize public policies. Each of us with our respective institutions. And after a couple of publications, the United Nations Development Program picked an interest in our work and saw a lot of potential in the tool to advise governments in prioritizing public policies. So they decided to fund a project this year to adapt our methodology to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And suddenly, we built a steering committee of several regulators and agencies in Mexico, for example, the Office for the President or the Ministry of the Treasury, and also not only federal level, but also local levels like the government of Mexico City, etc. So it's a very exciting time, and I'm very happy to tell you more about it. And this will be the outline of the talk. First, I will tell you a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals in case you're not familiar with this agenda. Then I will talk about the method, which is called Policy Priority Inference. Then I will show you some analysis with real-world data, and then some applications of what the method can do to advise policymakers. So if you're not familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals or the SDGs, I can quickly tell you basically that they try to push socioeconomic development forward. They try to take over the previous initiative, which was the Millennium Development Goals, by adding some other elements that have to do with environmental issues, and try to agree on an international agenda that was signed in 2015 by the different members from the United Nations to try to reach some of these goals. And basically, when you go to any international forum that has representatives of different governments, this is a question that everybody's looking at. How do we reach these goals? They can be very ambitious. So how do we do it? How do we reach the different topics that are covered by the Sustainable Development Goals? So we can start through the environment, sustainability. Goal 13 out of 17 different goals is the goal that has to do with climate action. So we can perhaps start emphasizing this problem. We can put some resources towards solving some issues in climate action. For example, we could subsidize green technologies. We could also introduce more strict regulations for carbon emissions. And not only we can improve this goal, but also through spillover effects, we can also improve other environmental issues, which are covered by other two goals, for example, life below water and life on land. So these kind of positive spillover effects in the literature of sustainable development are called synergies. So governments are trying to find these synergistic topics. But just as there are synergies, there are also trade-offs. For example, if we are too strict about carbon emissions, we will be probably disencouraging certain economic activities, which means we're going to slow down some of the economic growth. And that is going to be in opposition to goal 8, which has to do with economic growth. And there are also other spillover effects here. So if you slow down growth, probably you're going to affect a lot of the least well-off people. So goal number 1, end of poverty, you're going to probably not reach what you wanted in the beginning. So how do we deal with this? Well, maybe we also have to put some resources here. And chances are you're going to have to take resources from there and put them here. So this gives you a picture of the problem. This is a problem of allocation of resources, of prioritizing topics, prioritizing public policies. So how do we prioritize then? Well, what people is trying to do today is trying to quantify these interconnections, to try to find what are those networks that countries have, how do these different goals interact with each other. How do we do that? Well, they're trying to use data. So let me tell you a little bit about the data that people is using for sustainable development analysis. So this data is normally structured in 3 large pillars: social, economic, and environmental issues. Then you have the 17 goals, which are the squares that I just showed you, those tiles that you will find them everywhere, like even in the train station that I take to come here, there are some tiles in the floors. And then these are broken down into more than 100 objectives, which are more punctual, more precise goals. And finally, these objectives are further subdivided into more than 200 indicators. And these are specific measures taken by governments and different organizations to track the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The indicators were chosen in 2015, but they keep growing. Different organizations keep adding more and more. These indicators are time series. So for some countries have gathered these observations through many years. And what people is trying to use this time series to infer networks of interdependencies between these indicators. So you want to look how one indicator changes while another indicator changes as well. How do you do that? There are many methods. So actually, in a recent study that we conducted with our collaborator, Luis Ospina Forero, we made an extensive survey of all the relevant methods that are out there to use this data and estimate networks of interdependencies. So I'm going to show you an example of one of those many methods, and I'm happy to share the paper if anyone is interested. And for some reason that I don't understand, the figure is not showing the interconnections that it should be showing. But well, just imagine that there are connections, because the story that I'm going to tell you is that what you would observe is that across different countries, so in this paper we built this data set of 87 indicators covering 20 years for these 4 countries. And not many countries can afford to gather 20 years of data, to be honest. Many of these indicators are yearly observations. So on average, you would see the average country would have 5 observations on average across indicators. And once you apply these methods, what you will find is that applying the same method to different countries will give you very different network structures. So the example that I was going to show you for Mexico was that the goal number 3, which has to do with public health, has a lot of interconnections with indicators outside the goal of public health. And if you would look at other countries like Egypt, most of the interdependencies have to do with topics of public health rather than other topics. Public health and also with zero hunger. There is a very strong connectivity between these 2 goals. What this is suggesting is that for Egypt, it is very important to look at goal number 2 in order to be synergistic with public health. For Mexico, that's not so important anymore. And the networks, basically what they capture is the socioeconomic structure of the country, because how different topics interact, that depends on your natural resources, the nature of your economy, technological sophistication, culture, social norms, many different things. So this is a way to capture the context specificity of each nation. And, but the issue of development is complex not only because there are interdependencies between the different policy issues. It is also complex because there is a policymaking process generating this data. So if we just look at networks, we're just looking at aggregate relationships between data. But this is not telling us anything about how this data came to be. And let me give you an example of this process. So this is my mental model. So you have a central authority, which is the government in charge of prioritizing different topics. And you have some of these goals that the government has to decide to allocate resources to. So the government allocates resources to improve the quality of education. And well, there is a policymaker in charge of these topics. So it would be an agency or just a public official. That agent takes those resources and transforms them into policy, and eventually transforms the indicators that are being tracked for the quality of education. The interesting thing is that if anyone here is a policymaker or is experienced with policymaking, you will know that resources not necessarily translate into the outcomes that you wanted. There is a lot of waste in between. There are inefficiencies, there is lack of coordination, there is just a lack of capacity, there are unexpected events. There are many factors. So the fact is that you have inefficiencies throughout the process. Still, this would be okay because the government has supervision mechanisms. So if the government can track the indicators and the government knows how much it's putting in the resources, it can get estimates of how much resources are being lost in the process. The problem when it becomes interesting is when you have these network effects. Suppose public health improved significantly. Now you have healthier kids who have now better cognitive abilities. So they're going to perform better in the PISA tests, which are parts of the indicators of education. Likewise, if you have better infrastructure in the cities, perhaps in rural areas, kids don't have to walk anymore for hours, but now they can take a bus and take the new highway to get to the school in a shorter period. So by these two improvements, indicators of education improved. Not because of the resource that the government put forward in this topic, but because of these effects. So now what this is causing is that the agent in charge of improving education might have incentives to become more inefficient, because there's a story also behind about officials have incentives to be proficient, but also to extract personal gain. And the best example here in a developing context is just plain corruption. There are incentives to divert public funding. So this type of phenomenon is going to mask the performance of the agents. And this opaques the whole process for the government. And then if you add the fact that the government has to choose between not only these goals, but hundreds of indicators, hundreds of topics, and there are all these interdependencies, well, that is where we have complexity. So there is the network, but there is also the policymaking process. And this is why we develop policy priority inference, because we want to model this process. We want to model how these development indicators are generated. And our motivation, I just mentioned it in the previous slides. We want to consider the multidimensional challenge of development, the fact that these multiple dimensions are interconnected, and the complexity of the policymaking process. The proposal is to use agent computing, which is basically computer code to simulate the behavior of the agents, a learning process, and combine it with these spillover networks in order to create a tool that we can use to provide advice on policy prioritization, evidence-based advice. And so an overview of what it can do. So one of the things that it can do is it allows us to look at the effects of synergies and trade-offs. It also allows us looking at the retrospective priorities of governments. So if you have data of indicators of a certain period, you use that as an input of our model. And the model is going to return you what were the priorities of the government that generated that data according to our theory. And it's retrospective because those were the priorities during the period of your data. And because you now can infer what the government was doing, you might want to evaluate if what they were doing has been coherent with what they promised. So if a government signs, I'm going to follow the SDGs in the next 10 years and I'm going to reach these goals, I'm going to prioritize my policies according to that, well, is that coherent? Has that been coherent or not? We can also look at estimates on technical and allocative inefficiencies. So technical inefficiencies are this waste of resources that happens in the policymaking process. And allocative inefficiencies have to do with how do you distribute the resources. That means when you are overspending, where you should be spending less, or underspending, where you should be putting more resources. We can also perform ex-ante evaluations. So if governments have ideas of certain priorities that they want to follow or certain goals that they want to establish, the tool allows you to learn something about how efficient would be those development strategies. It allows us to identify topics that are resilient to certain events and also bottlenecks. What are those topics that are dragging you down, that are preventing you from reaching the goals that you want to reach? And also, we can look at institutional aspects, which is a very important topic in the development community. So what if we improve governance? Can that help us to decrease corruption and perhaps reach the goals that we have set in the beginning? So overall, you can do a lot of exploratory and discovery analysis to find different formulations for development strategies that might be more or less adequate to the specific context of a country. So in general, it is a computational model, and it takes three broad inputs. It takes the development indicators that you can get from any country. The UN has all this data, as I just explained. You input also a network, which you estimate through one of the many methods available. And then it takes the goals that the government wants to achieve. So if you're a consultant and you want to use the tool, a government is going to approach you and is going to tell you, well, I want to improve my environmental standards by this % by 10 years, and I want to grow at this rate and reach this goal. So it's going to give you specific values for the indicators. And these are going to be the aspirations of the government. So you give that to the model, and it's going to tell you what the priorities would be. And the priorities are reflected in a distribution of resources. So it's basically the funding that the government would allocate on average across these different development indicators. And believe it or not, this data doesn't exist in the real world. While some countries try to publish fiscal data, that doesn't mean that it is mapped into the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are other issues that I can discuss afterwards. And another variable that doesn't exist in the real world are exactly these inferences about how efficient are the public policies at the level of each topic. So a sketch of the model. You have the agent, government, which has a set of goals, the aspirations, takes resources, allocates it across its public officials. The official transform them into public policy. This is the real world. You have the spillover effects. All this is going on. And this produces the indicators that we have in the real world. So the model is going to produce the indicators, and we're going to try to match that. What happens that is interesting is, as I said, agents have incentives for a personal gain. So they're going to try to learn how much should I be inefficient and how much should I be proficient. So there's going to be a learning process. There is a supervision mechanism as well from the government. So the government might catch the agents being inefficient and might take action either by penalizing or by shifting resources somewhere else. Why the government should keep investing in a topic that has been historically waste. So you have all these endogenous processes going on. And this is an overview of how the model works. And some of the advantages that this approach offers are that, first, it offers a theoretical explanation of how policies are designed and implemented, which no other approach has. Like if you just look at data for the data, you're not going to get this. And what is interesting is that by talking with many of our partners in the project and their experience as policymakers, everything that they tell us of the processes, the miscoordinations, the lack of information, even corruption, it resonates very well with this theory that I just described to you. This also takes into account the networks, as I said. It's actually very easy to scale, so you can work with lots and lots of indicators. It considers the specificity of each country, because you have the specific indicators, the goals, the aspirations of the government, and the network. It allows to be internally and externally validated. So internal validation means you want to evaluate how coherent is your theory. Is it producing what it should? And external has to do with explaining data in the real world. And allows us to infer inefficiencies. And it is very easy to apply not only at the level of the countries, but also subnational levels, like we're doing with Mexico City and the state, and also specific sectors. If you have indicators on, let's say, public health or financial sector, you can look at specific topics. Now, very quickly, I'm going to tell you what we have done with actual data. So now, most of the publications that we have so far, we made them not in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what I will show you right now is from data that doesn't consider environmental issues. So we're currently working on adapting the framework to the SDGs. So this is mainly socioeconomic data that is divided in 13 pillars, just like the 17 goals. These are 13 pillars of development, almost 80 indicators across all these countries for these years. And what I will show you is two types of analysis, two types of outputs, very simple. First is the retrospective that I told you. So this is, given this period, what have the governments have been doing? And the other is prospective. So if I assume certain goals or aspirations that a government would want to achieve, what would the government do? And then I would connect those two in the story of policy coherence. So these are the 13 pillars of development. And just as an illustration, this is the kind of output that you would get from the model. So this is a distribution of resources produced by the model, aggregated across these 13 pillars. And here it has been also aggregated for the entire sample of countries. So this is not specific to a single country. So just an example of the type of output that you would get. And so this is the retrospective estimation. So in our sample, you can see that countries prioritize more technological readiness and then public health. And so because it is retrospective, this is arguably what countries have been doing during the period of 2006 to 2016. The more interesting question for us is, what would the governments do if we hypothesize about certain aspirations? And a very common way in the literature to do this is the story of the flying geese. So it is well known that the Asian countries, the Asian tigers, developed by following the example of another. So Korea followed the example of Japan, and Malaysia is following the example of Korea. This is very well documented in the literature. So a very common narrative about setting aspirations is just trying to imitate another country. So let me give you the example of Mexico trying to imitate Switzerland. It's quite ambitious, but we can hypothesize. So something that you can do is you can take the indicators of Mexico today and then take the indicators of Switzerland today and say, those indicators of Switzerland are going to be the goals of Mexico. Let's run the model and see what would be the priorities that Mexico would have to establish to reach those goals, considering all the context of Mexico, which is captured through the network, through the indicators, etc. So these are the priorities for Mexico. So these two are education, public governance. Not surprising. Then the next interesting exercise is, what if we change the aspirations of Mexico? Would we need to reorder these priorities a lot? So now let's aspire to be Japan. So the top two priorities didn't change too much. But for example, this one, which is technological readiness, is obviously more important if you want to become Japan. But what about now if we don't try Mexico? Let's try another case. Albania trying to become Spain, or Albania trying to become China. The reordering here is more radical. You can see that priority number 1 here drops to be number 4. So the story here is, again, the importance of context. It's about who you are, your network, your socioeconomic context, where you are, your indicators, how are you today, and who you want to be, the aspirations, the goals. So now that I have given you these two pieces, the retrospective and the prospective, now I can talk to you about coherence. And this is a very important topic in the international development community. The OECD has a full unit devoted to study policy coherence, and it has been producing annual reports on this concept for about 6 or 7 years already. So let me start with one of the opening phrases of the latest report by the Secretary General. Policy coherence for development calls for breaking out of policy silos, okay? So interdependencies. And increasing capacities to identify, understand, and manage interactions and interconnections among SDGs. It entails harnessing synergies, managing trade-offs, and policy conflicts, so the policymaking process, inefficiencies, and addressing the potential transboundary and intergenerational policy effects, causality, data-generating mechanisms of domestic and international action. So how is policy coherence measured today? So what they're trying to do by measuring it first is to answer, are governments' policies being coherent with their goals, or what they claim to be their goals? So the first approaches would look at public discourse and see if that matched more or less public policy programs that would be published somewhere in the official documents of governments. It's quite a difficult task. What it is done today is to look at these networks of interdependencies and see if countries are trying to focus on synergistic topics. It's still quite qualitative, and it's okay. It's a way to do it. But we can move beyond that. And with our approach, we have done it. So we have developed a way to quantify policy coherence. And the example that I will use, again, will be Mexico. And Mexico is a very good example because Mexico joined the OECD in 1994. And the story here is that Mexico had the aspiration of becoming an OECD country, of becoming a first world country. And so what we want to do is to evaluate whether that story, that public discourse, has been coherent with what they have been doing. And we don't know what they have been doing because these priorities are not observable. So we're going to infer them with policy priority inference. And the idea behind policy coherence for us has to do with a counterfactual world. Has to do with estimating what Mexico has been doing since it joined the OECD, the retrospective allocation, and comparing it with what Mexico would do if the real aspirations of Mexico would not be the final level of its indicators, but would be the indicators of one of the other countries in the OECD. So imitating an OECD country. If those two guys are similar, then Mexico has been coherent. So basically, a counterfactual means here what I would do if I would really pursue the goals that I'm claiming. So let me give you an example. So we estimated the case for Mexico trying to become Japan. And we get the two distributions of resources, the retrospective and the prospective, and we're going to plot them here. So this is the retrospective profile, and these are the prospective. If Mexico was fully coherent, all these dots would be on this line. It would be that each allocation that Mexico has been assigning has been identical to what Mexico would have need to do if it would have wanted to become Japan. And this is very cool because this shows us what is an allocative inefficiency. If the dots are above this line, that means that Mexico has been overspending in these topics. If they are below, it has been underspending if it wants to become Japan. So because we can measure this distance, we can construct an index, a metric, to measure policy coherence. And it's a very simple metric. It's like a correlation coefficient. It goes from -1 to 1. If you're on the negative side, you are incoherent. If you're on the positive side, you are being coherent. So we want to ask, has Mexico index been coherent? So we're going to compute that index for Mexico trying to imitate each one of the OECD members that were there before. And we're going to try to answer this question. So here's the result. We have ordered all the countries that Mexico can imitate, all the previous members of the OECD according to their income per capita. And this is the index that we get for each exercise. All negatives. Mexico has not been coherent. To me, as a Mexican, not surprising. But at least I was expecting something. I was expecting that Mexico at least would have been trying to be more coherent with the most developed countries. So to have a kind of positive relationship here, which we don't see. And perhaps if you're not familiar with the Mexican context, this is not telling you much. So what if I show you the example of successful countries? And I validate my whole story. Let's talk about Korea. Korea joined the OECD 2 years after Mexico. And we all know that, relative to Mexico, Korea has been quite successful. Not only that, but we also know in the literature that Korea has explicitly imitated the Japanese mode in many ways. It's part of the story of the flying geese. So if we perform this exercise for Korea, we would expect two things. For Korea to be at least coherent in most cases, but the other, to see Japan with a high level of coherence. The results. And by the way, I forgot to mention that the red line is the income level of, in this case, of Korea. So there you have it. Japan, number 1. Korea has been the most coherent with Japan. We just couldn't believe when we got this result. And not only that, all of them are positive, and you also have the positive relationship. So Korea has systematically been trying to imitate the countries that are doing things right. And I can show you a second example, Estonia. Estonia joined much more recently, like 10 years ago. So you would not expect such levels of coherence. However, with Estonia, we know that it has been trying to get away of Russia in any possible way, and to get close to the Nordic countries. So it is known that they have tried to imitate Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and also to follow a very high-tech-oriented strategy. So this is Estonia. Positive relationship, some incoherent, some coherent, but Denmark, Finland, Japan, Sweden. So this is what we call like soft validation. So this is closing the story and just showing you that the method and the things that we can do makes sense. We can quantify things that we couldn't before. And we can take real advantage of the data that is generated every day. And I will just close by just summarizing that there is this tool, this computational framework, that can take into account this high dimensionality, all these interactions through networks. It can model the complexities of the policymaking process to give us inferences on the allocations of resources, and it has a lot of flexibility to different contexts. I close with this and just invite you, in case you are interested in learning more, this is the official website in the Turing. And we recently, as part of the project, developed kind of a little leaflet for general dissemination. If you want to share this with some policymakers that you might think would be interested, you can download it from my own website. And thank you very much.